3 years after Brooks Weller ordered me out of our Denver townhouse. I saw him standing outside the Aspen Arts Trust like winter had kept him there. His collar was turned up against the mountain wind. His hands were bare, and the expensive coat failed to hide the panic thinning his face. I had just left a funding review with Meredith Knox beside me, her leather portfolio under one arm, holding every document he once dismissed. Brooks looked at the portfolio before he looked at me, and that small mistake told me why he had crossed Colorado to find me. My name is Arden Wells, and the last time my husband spoke to me in person, he gave me one night to disappear from our life. Now he stood outside a building where my signature could freeze the project he needed to keep his consulting career alive. I did not slow down until he stepped into my path, careful not to touch me, desperate enough to forget he had no right. Arden, he managed, and my name sounded smaller in his mouth than it had the night he threw it away. Meredith shifted beside me. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just close enough to remind him that this time I had a witness. I kept my voice even because rage had stopped being useful years ago, and usefulness was the only language Brooks had ever respected. You have 10 seconds to tell me whether this is personal or professional, I said. Watching him understand both answers would cost him. For 3 years, he had lived inside the lie that ruined me, and now he needed permission from the woman it failed to erase. 3 years before Aspen, Brooks and I lived in a rented townhouse near Washington Park, where the radiators hissed, and our marriage still looked ordinary. We argued about grocery runs, split the rent from separate accounts, and kept a corkboard calendar crowded with deadlines, dinners, and Denver weather warnings. I was 31, managing cultural partnerships for a nonprofit arts network, while Brooks built public funding proposals with the confidence of a man everyone trusted. That trust was the thing I still believed we had, until the night I came home carrying wine and found judgment waiting in my kitchen. I had bought an Oregon Pinot and a lemon tart because I planned to tell him I had been nominated for partnership director. It was not a fairy tale promotion, just the kind of hard-earned step that proves years of quiet work were not invisible. Snow had started falling by the time I turned onto our street, and Colette Price's silver Volvo was already in our spot. She never came by without texting, which was the first wrong thing, though not yet the thing that scared me. Brooks stood beside the table with his arms folded. Colette sat at my laptop, and Serena Vale leaned near the window like she belonged there. The screen showed text messages between my number and Grant Maddox. Time-stamped across 4 months, matched to evenings, Brooks had been traveling. They mentioned restaurants I had visited, phrases I used. Even a private joke Colette once heard me make over margaritas downtown. Then Colette clicked a voice memo, and a woman who almost sounded like me laughed through the speaker, for saying guilt had never felt lighter. That is not me, I said, but Brooks did not reach for my phone, my calendar, or even the truth sitting in my face. Serena lowered her eyes too slowly. Colette pressed her lips together too carefully, and Brooks stared like a man protecting a decision already made. I want you out tonight, he said, and the tart box bent in my hand before I realized I was still holding it. Not tomorrow. Not after questions. Not after checking one single fact. But tonight, because the verdict had arrived before I did. I stood in that kitchen with the lemon tart crushed against my coat, watching 3 faces pretend surprise had brought them together. Colette's eyes were wet, but her breathing stayed too steady, and Serena's silence had the shape of someone waiting for applause. Brooks looked wounded, yet not confused, and that was the detail my body understood before my mind could follow. This was not a marriage asking for answers. This was a courtroom where the sentence had been written before I arrived. I set the tart on the counter and asked, "Did you check anything before deciding this was true?" Brooks looked at the floor. His silence landed harder than the voice memo. Because fake evidence can be built, but cowardice always answers in its own language. Colette reached toward me and murmured, "Arden, I didn't want it to happen like this, with Serena watching from the window. I looked at the woman who knew my passwords, my grief, my habits, and answered, "Then you should not have built it." Upstairs, I packed like someone escaping a fire no one else would admit they had started. Passport, laptop, backup drive, tax folder, and the envelope of statements from the account Brooks had used for Serena's project. I did not know yet what those papers would become, only that my hands reached for them before my heart reached for mercy. When I came back down, Serena shifted aside, and a small smile touched her mouth before she buried it. I saw it clearly enough to carry with me into the snow, cleaner than rage and colder than fear. Brooks stayed near the table. Colette stayed near the lie, and Serena stayed near the future she thought she had stolen. I opened the door myself, because nobody in that room deserved the last gesture of helping me leave. The cold hit my face, and I walked out before they could ask for a performance of pain. I drove south out of Denver with the backup drive in my bag, my phone face down, and snow dragging white lines across the windshield. I did not call Brooks, did not call Colette, and did not give Serena the satisfaction of hearing me break in real time. The only person I called was Meredith Knox in Santa Fe, my cousin who could make panic sound like paperwork. "Drive south. Keep your location off. And do not delete anything," she said. And I obeyed, because obedience to sense felt safer than grief. By dawn, Meredith had tea waiting, a blanket over the couch, and a blank notebook open on her kitchen table. She did not ask whether the messages were real, because the bag in my hand and my face had already answered enough. After 3 hours of sleep, she made me write everything before shock softened the edges, from the Volvo outside to Serena's buried smile. Times, sentences, positions, the voice memo, the tart box, Brooks looking at the floor instead of checking one fact. I wanted to disappear, but Meredith understood disappearance only worked if the record stayed alive behind me. She copied my files, photographed the envelope of statements, and labeled every screenshot I still had from the account Brooks used for Serena's project. I was not ready for court, not ready for Denver, not ready to hear my own name in anyone's mouth. So I took a temporary job with a small arts museum in Santa Fe, earning less money but breathing cleaner air. For the first time, nobody around me knew the woman Colette had invented, and that quiet became a kind of shelter. I learned grant files, disclosure forms, board minutes, conflicts of interest, and the polite language institutions use before they close a door permanently. At night, I read my timeline until the words stopped shaking and started looking like evidence. I had not lost because I left Denver. I had changed rooms before they realized the house was not theirs to keep. While I learned to breathe in Santa Fe, Brooks and Serena learned how much a quiet woman could be used after she was gone. He told people our marriage had ended after a private betrayal, never naming me directly, which somehow made the accusation travel faster. Serena arrived beside him slowly, first at donor lunches, then at gallery receptions, then inside the projects I had once helped him understand. She called herself the person who stayed during a difficult season, and Denver rewarded the lie because it sounded cleaner than adultery. Colette kept her podcast voice soft and moral, the same voice she had used while sitting at my laptop that night. She never said my name, but she spoke about women who destroy female friendships for male attention, and our old circle understood the shape. Grant Maddox turned the rumor into a drinking story, telling event clients he had once ruined a marriage without even trying. Every version gave them distance from the crime and gave me the role of the woman too ashamed to answer. Meredith sent me screenshots when someone forwarded clips, not to hurt me, but to keep the record from being buried. Brooks had not only let the lie stand, he had built professional safety around it, using pity as insulation. Then I found the older bank statements again, the ones showing payments from our joint account into expenses tied to Serena's grant work. When Meredith saw the dates, she tapped the paper and said, "This is not heartbreak anymore. Arden, this is a pattern." That sentence changed the way I looked at the silence they had mistaken for surrender. Brooks needed me guilty so he could look betrayed. Serena needed me erased so she could look chosen. And Colette needed me dirty so her envy looked like loyalty. Grant needed the rumor because being rejected by me had bruised something smaller than pride and meaner than desire. They had not just lied about one night. They had spent years spending the lie like money. The crack did not come from guilt, because guilt would have required more courage than any of them had shown since Denver. It came from Grant Maddox getting left outside an Aspen reception Serena had promised would introduce him to better clients. The next week in Boulder, he drank too much and told a freelancer that some women were easier to erase than others. That sentence reached Meredith through a compliance contact, and her message arrived while I was reviewing grant disclosures after midnight. "He is talking, which means he kept something," she wrote, and I felt the old kitchen return without warning. We did not call him, threaten him, or give him the pleasure of knowing he had shaken me. My lawyer sent a preservation letter requiring him to keep every message, audio file, payment record, an account tied to my name. Grant had always been brave around women he could corner, but legal paper made him smaller almost immediately. Within 10 days, his attorney offered a partial production before anyone filed suit, which told me panic had finally outrun loyalty. Grant gave up the raw voice memo, draft texts, a burner number log, and a payment labeled consulting from an account linked to Brooks. He also produced messages where Serena corrected the wording, pushing details only Colette could have supplied from inside my life. One line showed Serena telling him to make it less dramatic because Brooks only needed enough truth-shaped noise to stop asking questions. I listened to the original audio in a conference room with beige walls and a glass of water I never touched. Colette's voice came through first, laughing, stopping, then repeating the sentence they had cut into the lie 3 separate times. She finally asked whether it sounded enough like Arden, and Serena answered, "Brooks wants to believe it, and that is enough." I did not cry when the room went silent, because the proof did not hurt more than the betrayal. It gave the betrayal a receipt. By the time Brooks found me in Aspen, I was program director at the trust reviewing cultural partnerships that crossed public money and private donors. His newest project had reached final consideration, polished on the surface, full of language about community access, regional memory, and responsible stewardship. Then I saw Serena Vale listed as a consultant in the appendix, hidden under a subcontract line that looked too careful to be accidental. The budget structure carried the same fingerprints as the old statements Meredith had archived, and my name was suddenly standing where his lie expected a locked door. I did not touch the scoring file after that, because revenge only works if it survives daylight and procedure. I recused myself from the formal vote, documented the prior relationship, and sent compliance a confidential ethics memo with bank records, payment dates, and Grant's production summary. The memo did not call Brooks a villain or Serena a mistress, because the documents were cleaner without my anger. They showed undisclosed personal ties, prior financial entanglement, and a reputational risk no funding board could pretend was decorative. 2 days later, Brooks was waiting outside the Aspen Arts Trust, pale with the knowledge that process had finally learned his name. "Please, Arden, this project is everything," he said, stepping close enough for desperation but not close enough to forget witnesses. I looked at the man who had once needed no proof to throw me into the snow, now begging proof to look away. "That was your mistake 3 years ago," I answered, keeping my hand on the folder. "You keep confusing your emergency with my responsibility." He tried to say he had been deceived, and the word landed between us like something cheap dropped on marble. I let him stand inside it for a second, because the raw audio had already answered what he still wanted softened. "You were not helpless," I said. watching his face lose the last of its practiced grief. "You were convenient." He looked past me toward the building, toward the boardroom, toward the future he had expected me to protect out of habit. I walked inside without turning around, because this time the door closed from my side. The week after, Brooks stood outside the trust. My attorney filed the complaint. They had spent 3 years believing I was too quiet to write. Colette, Serena, Grant, and Brooks were named for defamation, false light, intentional emotional harm, and civil conspiracy built from recorded lies. The filing did not need purple language, because the raw audio, payment labels, burner logs, and bank records carried the story without performance. Meredith sat beside me while I signed, one hand flat on the table, steady as a door that knew exactly when to close. The financial piece moved next, colder and harder for Brooks to explain than any broken marriage ever could. My attorney requested accounting for the joint funds Brooks had pushed toward expenses tied to Serena before he threw me out. Those statements did not make him look heartbroken. They made him look invested in the woman standing inside the lie before I even reached the kitchen. When his lawyer called it a private marital misunderstanding, mine answered that private did not mean harmless, and marital did not mean free. Then reputation began doing what reputation does when paperwork finally enters the room. Colette's main sponsor paused her podcast contract after Grant's production summary confirmed the voice memo had been rehearsed and edited from her recording. Serena was removed from the consultant roster, pending ethics review, because no board wanted her name near public money with that email attached. Grant's event clients started canceling quietly, not from outrage, but from the practical fear of hiring a man whose files followed him. Nobody needed me to post a thread, leak a clip, or turn my pain into entertainment for strangers. The documents moved through attorneys, compliance officers, sponsors, and review boards, which made the damage slower but much harder to dismiss. Colette asked for a private meeting through her lawyer, and I declined before the sentence finished loading on the screen. Grant offered settlement if his name stayed clean, but my attorney refused any term that made the truth disappear for his comfort. Serena tried calling the whole thing a misunderstanding between ambitious women, which would have been funny if it had not been so practiced. Brooks came once more, no longer asking for the project, only for me to say he had not meant to destroy me. I looked at the man who had used my silence as shelter and said, "You did not need to plan the lie to benefit from it." His face changed then, because there was no softer version left to hide inside. Brooks lost the Aspen project first, and then 2 pending proposals were pulled for review after the disclosure failure followed him back to Denver. Nobody called him a criminal, because the truth was smaller and more useful than that. They called him unreliable, which in his world was worse, because his entire career had been built on rooms trusting his judgment. The man who once refused to check one fact about me now watched committees check every line of him. Serena's consultant contracts disappeared with less noise and more permanence, which suited the way she had always preferred damage to happen. The ethics review did not need to call her a mistress. It only needed the email, the payments, and her edits to Grant's fake messages. Boards that handle public and private money do not gamble on people who treat disclosure forms like decoration. By spring, her name no longer appeared in the spaces she had once entered beside Brooks, smiling like a reward. Colette's podcast sponsor paused first, then withdrew after settlement language, confirmed she had participated in creating false material that damaged my reputation. She sent one final message through her attorney, saying she hoped someday I would understand how lost she had been. I did understand, just not in the way she wanted, because lost people ask for help instead of building traps. Grant sold equipment to cover legal fees, and the clients who once laughed at his stories stopped returning calls when his name became searchable for the wrong reasons. Meredith and I signed the final papers in a quiet conference room with vending machine coffee and no ceremony at all. Afterward, She opened a cheap bottle of wine at her apartment, and I finally let myself breathe without counting exits. I thought I needed them to admit I was innocent, I told her, staring at the glass between my hands. Meredith looked at the signed folder on the table and answered, "No, Arden, you needed the record to stop lying." A year after the papers were signed, I walked into an Aspen Gallery opening and saw my name printed beside director. Not wife. Not scandal. The room was warm with coats, wine, donors, and the quiet respect that arrives when your work finally speaks before your history. I had bought a small condo near the Pines, kept my mornings simple, and stopped rehearsing explanations for people who had earned none. Brooks mailed one final letter saying he understood if forgiveness never came, and I read it once before placing it in a drawer. I did not tear it up, because rage no longer needed a ceremony, and I did not answer, because silence had become a boundary. I once left Denver in the snow with one bag, a damaged name, and no proof anyone would ever believe me. 3 years later, they were the ones standing outside closed doors, while I lived inside a life no lie could unlock. If this story stayed with you, thank you for listening until the end, and tell me which moment felt the most real. If you have ever rebuilt quietly after someone rewrote your name, this space is yours too. So subscribe, and stay close.